Okay, now we are on to the sixth part of Melodic Black Metal Redux in An Exhaustive Study. In the sixth part, we continue on the second part of our treatment of 1994. And now we're not here to just, decide what is melodic black metal and what isn't. A lot of these things were either labeled as such across multiple points on the internet, or they were cataloged as such in other ways. Some of them I selected just for their relevance to the conversations earlier in 1992 and 1993, where we talked about melodic death metal's indistinct influence upon a lot of black and death metal in general, and the way that black metal took on a lot of those characteristics as bands either went one way or the other. A lot of bands went full melodic death metal once that took off. A lot of bands went full black metal as that took off. But there was a lot of in between that should be addressed because it's relevant to melodic black metal and the way it's perceived today, where there's still a lot of death metal and a lot of melodic black metal that we get today. And seeing the impetus of this shows kind of how subgenre should be taken with a grain of salt, but also understanding the nuance of these things and where they came from. So that's what I've been building up to along the way. And now that we get to some actual black metal in 1994, I think that that becomes easier to see. And then I sort of doom and gloom about how the fact that a lot of pop metal bullshit is coming up past 1994, but we don't need to worry about that just yet. Also, I don't have Vinterland's A Castle So Crystal Clear, and I don't have Saxorior's The First Fight. Saxorior is a sort of well-known underground band out of Germany who are known for more of a thrashing, sort of indistinct thrash death metal, but also melodic black metal touched sound that is entirely their own form of heavy metal. And I don't have their first demo tape. A lot of their material is hard to find. I really enjoy the band. So if you have either of those two demos, either send them to me or send me a link so I can listen to them. So the first thing we're going to get into here is Calvary. In Solitude is, I believe, their second demo. They might have had a rehearsal in there somewhere too, but this Sardinia-based melodic black death metal band are best known for their Across the River of Life EP, which is probably more in the progressive death metal side of things overall, and that is showing through on this 1994 demo. You can tell that they're influenced by Nocturnus. On the same side of things, you can tell they were influenced by black and death metal and even melodic black metal and melodic black death metal and what was going on in Sweden at the time. I wouldn't say that it is a one-to-one sort of thing. You could say that some of these were arrived upon per the same interest a lot of the fellows in Sweden had, whether it was enjoying the first Atheist record or whatever else. But basically what we get here are pretty prominent keyboards in death metal. We get some black metal vocals, and we get a lot of outbursts in every direction. This is a pretty interesting band and a really unique demo in its aesthetics, and all of these clashing ideologies and aesthetics kind of making an interesting band at the time. So they'd split by 1996. There isn't a lot of all that interesting history there, but I felt like this was the most interesting release by the band to feature here because it seems like it's the result of some of those influences from that we'd mentioned earlier in 1992 and 93, filtering into a band that was also interested in Florida death metal and the way that a lot of the Swedish artists were at the time. So, unique group, and I'll feature the song here that I mentioned because I think it is the best sort of window into all these points that I'm making. Lord Belial is actually a pretty well-known Swedish black metal band these days, and early on, they put out kind of an atmospheric death metal demo. It was a strange thing. I don't really know how I would describe their 1993 demo tape. It was unsure of what it was, and it was still rough in its performances, and the instrumentation was not sure how to put together a song yet in any serious way, from my point of view. And on this demo tape, Into the Frozen Shadows, we find them completely capable of putting together these brilliant, sophisticated black metal songs that are remarkably melodic and layered in a beautiful way with a lot of keyboards and a strong sense of melody. This was a big leap onto this demo tape, and it's not surprising that they were signed to No Fashion right away. As soon as they heard it, they took this tape off the demo market and stopped selling it and got to work on their debut. Another fine record that we'll talk about next, in the 1995 section of this exploration. But this tape gives us a good preview of what they were all about, what they were capable of. And I would say this is a rare band. I think they were ready to put together an album as they were preparing this demo. They'd found their knack and their focus. And I think back in the day, I avoided this group because I confused them with Throne of Ahaz. And I didn't like Throne of Ahaz very much early on. But I've gone back and now explored both discographies, more recently, and so I appreciate both bands quite a bit, and understand the very distinct differences between the two groups in terms of their contributions to Swedish black metal. I think this is more outwardly melodic than a lot of their work overall, and I think it's a good transition point into their conversations about their full length, which we'll get to again at another time. So I think you realize why this was a demo and a band that people jumped on early on, because they really seem to have taken a leap off into the deep end with this demo. So I would like to further delineate the indecision between the Hellenic black metal scene and a lot of the death metal that was still hanging on, a lot of the black metal that was still influencing these bands, and again, the huge effect that the Peaceful 3 and British melodic death doom and gothic doom metal had on the Hellenic metal scene in general. So it's a lot to take in, I guess, but basically, if you're a fan of a lot of the early death metal into black metal transitions available to the Athens, Greece scene, you probably should check out Invocation's Ars Moriendi. It's a demo tape self-released in this year after they had been plugging away at another band named Behemoth, which is much more focused on death metal, though they do pull some songs from Behemoth into this demo tape. But this is something closer to their gothic doom metal sound that transitions into black metal segments along the way. That's the way I see it. Like, you could say that this is maybe more of a gothic doom metal, gothic black metal. There's a lot that happens on this demo tape that also includes death metal, pretty forceful death metal at that. So there's I like that gray area. You can't. It's hard to predict what this band would have been, where they would have come out if they had put out an album around the time of all the ideas were feeding into this demo tape. So for me, that's really interesting to think of those possibilities, while also appreciating the many points of interest that show up on a demo like this. And I think we can continue that conversation when we talk about the Flowers on My Grave, their 1996 demo tape, because maybe that more distinctly picks a direction to go in. But sort of like Calvary, the Italian band that we mentioned a couple moments ago, this is it's that point of indecision that's so interesting about a lot of the Mediterranean or Hellenic area groups, where they weren't sure what direction to go in, because there was so many interesting styles sprouting up around them, that finding that specific sound was either really important, or doing a bit of everything might have been a more interesting future for a lot of those groups. So I don't know that this band ever went anywhere. It seems like they might have managed a full length eventually. I don't think so. So just an interesting outlier here. I have some pretty interesting stories about Old Man's Child. I think this is a band that maybe I've met, or it's a along in the distant past. It's a group that I reviewed and covered for some of my earliest, metal journalism things that I did in the late '90s, and covering their second full-length album is a story that maybe I'll get to at another time, but. I kind of went backwards in their discography from that point and didn't discover In the Shades of Life until much later, finding their first record a little bit rough around the edges, really loving their second record, and their third was something else, I guess. We'll say that. But I'll comment more on those as we get to them. But this first demo tape was something that I'd always known as a split album between Dimmu Borgir that had me thinking, well, these bands are related in some way, but I didn't realize there was a lot of history there until much later. Uh, Galder or Grusom grew up in the same town as the folks from Dimmu Borgir, who we will talk about in the next part for their first year, which was full of rehearsal demo tapes and an EP. But his style was actually not that different from some of what they were doing. It was obviously more involved. It was more influenced by things like thrash metal. He was he must have been taking classical guitar lessons at some point in his life, because that features as part of his sound, and his unique vocals are over the top across the board and always substantial and interesting in the layering they bring to each song. He's a writer of sophisticated melodies that I've always appreciated, and that's more obvious later on, but it is here on this tape, which is maybe more resolutely black metal and not so much melodic metal. And a lot of people find some of his work quite cheesy later on, and I understand that. But if we stick to the '90s stuff that he did, you'll find that there's something pretty sophisticated about this demo tape, and there are multiple versions of it with different sound quality. I think the picture here is from the '95 release of it with some extra songs, and there's a CD edition of it. There's a split. There's many different versions of this tape, and all of them are pretty strong. Um, I believe there was some early input from Alderon from Dorheimskard, and this was supposed to be a split release with Vedwen's End at some point. So there were a lot of hands going into this very involved or exciting group that was showing up here at the time, and it turned out that this is probably one of their more, I guess, laid back and less exuberant releases. It feels more serious than some of their other stuff. It very much relates to our discussion of melodic black metal, because melody is sort of inherently the most important part of good, memorable music. This musician has always had a strong grasp on it, and obviously I'm a fan of that. But I think that if this band never stood out to you, but you're still interested in Norwegian black metal and melodic black metal from Norway, this is an important group, and someone who's always really stood out among the crowd in a very palpable way. So definitely check this demo out if you've always shied away from the symphonic black metal thing and didn't think there was any substance to Old Man's Child, because I think if you revisit his early work with an open mind, you'll find that it's pretty important to our discussion here. So with Ancient's 7-inch Det Glemt Riket in 1994, we sort of take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. These two songs are probably the most complete and serious pieces that Ancient has written to this point in 1994. And it's some of the strongest material besides the Trolltar EP that they'd written during the original duo with Grimm in the project still. But they're poorly recorded. They were fairly well preserved and remastered at some point, from what I understand. And like the first song here features quite loud wind throughout the song that sweeps in and out of it. It's a very interesting conceptual scene-setting song, and Huldredans is maybe more of a folkish sort of obsessed melody that pushes through the whole thing. There's a really strong rhythmic component that never becomes very sophisticated. So it's not the best showing from the band, but it is a distinct one, and one that further explores kind of the heavy metal influence of the band, and especially with some of their more outright guitar driven moments on that first song. So nothing to overanalyze. I think it's just a notable release. We'll have more to say about the next EP and the first album when we get there. So if you have not heard of Sorath, this is a Pilsen, Czechia-based black death metal band who are known for melodic black death metal along the way, more towards the late 90s. Here in 1994, they put out their first, basically a full-length demo tape. It's the compositions are tentative, the speed is not quite there, the urgency is not there with their performances, but the framework that they put down here is a full album's worth of ideas, which are sort of splitting the difference between primitive black metal, something like the third Bathory album meets death metal, and in most ways it's not really melodic. There are melodies in the album, but it's not so outright in the style of the times. So if you're a fan of Dark Throne or Bathory of a certain era, and you appreciate a little bit of Celtic Frost in there too, there's some of that on here. It's also a death metal demo. And a demo outright. It is a demo tape, and expect the quality to be fine enough and fully readable, but these performances are not necessarily in time or completely engaged all the time in their musicianship. That said, this is a strong beginning for a band that would become very impressive over the next several releases, and I wanted this to serve as a preamble to see what they could do, and the ambition of the band early on. I love the tape. I love the symbolism of it. I like the cover. It's a cool thing that we're getting from these guys, from something different than a lot of what was happening with the Czech bands of the time. But also we're getting something other than dark metal from the black death metal arena at the time too. So take this as a strong preamble for what they would be doing later on, but also take note that they had other bands at the time as well that are worth checking out, more closer related to Death Doom and Black Doom along the way. So this will be more relevant once we get to talk about their next tape. This Norwegian black metal band, Kvist, were originally a quartet, and they featured Trondor Nefas, who was an early and important member of Urgehall from 1992 until I think 2012 when he passed away. Now, he only spent one demo, the first 94 demo from Kvist, with the band, and provided the second guitar position. Otherwise, the core trio of this band there's just not a lot of information on this band, and they've always kept it close to their chest. They've done a couple of interviews in, I guess, nationalistic zines back in the day. There's vague mentions of them in interviews with the artists involved and other projects. So, there's an air of mysterious quality to their work because it was always quite sophisticated and brilliantly presented on these demo tapes and rehearsals from the time. I've grouped together their 94 demo and their rehearsal largely because these are mostly the same songs in the same quality. I think they're both rehearsal recorded items. The demo tape does not sound like it was done on like an 8-track or anything like that. The songs are performed with the same consistency. There's obviously very strong guitarists in this band, and that's mostly where a lot of the interest comes, although the way that they guide melodies through with keyboards is very effective for its time. A lot of these songs are inherently melodic and presented in a way that was not out of the realm of Norwegian black metal at the time, but obviously quite different. The riff style here is in that league in some ways, but I wouldn't overstep that so much because I think this band has been ignored for several decades beyond the release of their debut, but then somehow championed like crazy online for the quality of that debut, and that's led to a lot of people really overly praising these demo tapes. We get a very strong outline of those songs here on these tapes, but we don't get anything near the quality of that debut. Strong provenance for what would appear. A lot of those same songs appear here in different forms, and altogether, you should know this band if you're a fan of Norwegian black metal or melodic black metal, because they're a fine example of the high standard, more so on, admittedly, on their debut. So I've not gotten a chance to talk about Daniel Black Moon and his contributions to both death metal and black metal because I chose to skip over early Necrophobic, and the main reason I did that is because I didn't feel like discussing how much I loved Necrophobic, and the first record had all that much to do with the way that melodic black metal formed. It was maybe more important to talk about dissection early on to make that point. But of course, yeah, Black Moon's contributions in the realm of guitar work were always very important to black metal, and especially as he moved away from Necrophobic. He put out an unofficial demo tape with Necrophobic around 1994, and he was out of the band just as quickly. Um, and that meant that he was still a guest on their next record in 1997, which we will talk about later on. Um, but it meant that he had other projects he wanted to work on, which were all focused on black metal. Mostly, yeah, most all black metal overall. Dark Funeral was one of them. He formed it with Lord Ahriman, the second guitarist, back in 1993, I believe. And they took off with it, signed to Hellspawn for this first EP. Now, most people say it sounds like he was taking cues from Dissection at the time. Frankly, I think that he developed alongside Dissection's sound, and Necrophobic were much more sophisticated than Dissection were by the time their debut came out. There's no way that you could just say that. It's almost insulting to think that. While John Nodvight's contributions to melodic death metal and melodic black death metal and all that were very important, I think Necrophobic's style of guitar playing, when you excised the death metal force out of it, was very strongly melodic in most ways. It's a separate thing from my point of view, but Necrophobic would be known for different things over time, and they carried the zeitgeist better than Dissection ever did. That's, we can argue on that at another point. It's hard not to get on a tangent here and talk about other things, because I've never found like the first Dark Funeral record was so notable and needed to be talked about, other than the fact that it had Black Moon on it, and it was his signature work that made it something special at the time. And I don't want to take away from the other musicians involved. This was a unique undertaking for this EP because it had the bassist vocalist, who played in pre-Amon Amarth band Scum, and it had another member, the drummer, who is better known for his late 90s to, I think, 2010s work in Svartsin. What we get here is certainly black metal, melodic black metal at its heart. It is driven by guitar work almost solely. There's some great over-the-top vocals here and a strong enough bass presence. This is a unisound production, and it was very well made for its time. It's never quite needed remastering from my point of view, and I think that it carries the spirit of melodic black metal very strongly in 1994 in the Swedish style. It doesn't feel like a death metal record. It doesn't feel fully transitional, as some have said before. This is a great record, but I will say, and I say it on here, I don't, I never felt like this was an essential, and I never felt like it was such an essential release for melodic black metal discussion. For me, it's sort of the way of bringing up Necrophobic without directly doing it, because I feel like they were more related to death metal early on. The same way talking about Marduk would kind of been off topic, other than just talking about Swedish metal. So anyway, I mean, this is a pretty strong record. I could see why someone would really get into it. I've always appreciated it and spent a lot of time with it. But it's not my favorite stuff from Parland, and it's not my favorite stuff from Dark Funeral. I've always been a little bit more excited about their debut, the 1996 album, and that's pretty much where I kind of cut off my interest in the band. But there's some good stuff here and there with Dark Funeral. So we'll talk more about that when the full length shows up, and see where they took it eventually. But definitely give this some time and see how you feel about it. I just have long-lasting, strong opinions about it from years ago. Chained and Desperate is a Piraeus and Athens-based a Greek death metal band, and one that started as a death doom metal group. And this is I think the third or fourth demo tape out of 6 that they released before they put out a full-length album in, I think, 1998 or 1999. Is the album to sort of showcase their transition from melodic death doom or gothic death doom, or the slow pace of their original recordings, into something that was more influenced by the Hellenic black metal style, the Greek black metal style. And you'll hear that crops up here and there along the lines of this sort of long demo tape. But this is our point of entry, the same way as Sorath's first demo tape was our point of entry into their world. This is not quite fully transitioned into melodic black metal, but they will do so on the next demo tape, and I wanted to make sure we saw this step in between rather than jumped right into it and had like 4 demos to talk about. So interesting thing about this band, they're named after a new wave of British heavy metal group's album, and I like that record quite a bit. So I didn't know it was directly named after that. Kind of a bad name if you think about it. Still a charming demo tape, and one that has some interesting creativity applied to their sound, even though they're still kind of fumbling through their rhythms. On their next demo tape, they find their rhythms, and I'll be more excited to talk about that one. But I think for context, start here, basically. However you frame the history of Epoch of Unlight, this United States-based band out of Tennessee, you'll find that their first demo tape, Beyond the Pale, was really the breaking away from the traditional death metal style of what they've been working on since the early 90s, and now transitioning into something that was more resolutely a melodic death metal style. There are some blackened aspects of it as per United States metal of the time, and they were conscious of what was going on in Scandinavia at the time, the same way bands like Estuary of Calamity or just Estuary were at the time. So we see that transition from a more brutal death metal style that was common in the Midwest in the early 90s towards a more sophisticated or melodic style here. And I think this band was always good, even on their earliest demos. If you check out that Requiem demo, it's a pretty cool tape. And this is a really well recorded, very strong just death metal demo in general. But there are influences from melodic death metal, melodic black death metal on this thing that enhance its quality. And I just really appreciated the professional sound of this group. And the way I put it, it's sort of like early a Canorous Quintet meets something like Vital Remains. And I appreciated that. It's a solid demo tape. I think I put the wrong record label on here. I think it was self-released, not Lament. So correct that as you see fit. And definitely check out this tape. I think it's pretty solid. This band has been great ever since. They put out a bunch of records for the end in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. They recently came back in 2022. We might talk about some other records along the way. Withered Beauty were a melodic death metal or melodic black death metal band out of Gävle, Sweden. Now, if you have ever followed and looked through the list of bands out of Gävle, there's not very many of them, and we could have suspected by the sound and some of the Bathory-esque influences on this thing that one of the main components of this band was a fellow who was also responsible for Isol and Arab Altor. There were other folks involved in this sound and this band, and it was a pretty sophisticated demo for 1993. I think that they'd formed pretty quickly and they'd come up with the sound. It was very pretty solid study of what was around at the time, but apparently they've been writing it since the early 90s, and that meant there are some strong death metal influences all over this thing. When they went to record it, they'd brought a lot of these songs up to speed, and that involved a lot of dual rhythm guitar parts. There was a lot more blunt rhythm guitar parts depending on the influence of the song at the time, and that meant there are both polyrhythmic and intense parts to some of these songs, and there's more straightforward parts. So it's a really balanced group of pieces that went into this demo tape, and I think it was a little bit late for its time. The band name wasn't great. It took them a while to put it all together, and they were involved in a lot of other bands at the time. Some of them were, and basically, this is it's basically an album's worth of material. There's 34 minutes, and it's the first of 2 demos, which were very impressive. So they proved they were ready for it. They put out an album in 1998 on Nuclear Blast, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But this is kind of one of those gems from Sweden that not a lot of people talk about, maybe because it was just it was seemingly average for its time, or the band were more interested in other things, and it's never really been sported as a important contribution. Both of the tapes from Withered Beauty are very much worth listening to, especially if you enjoy the distinct sound of melodic black death metal out of Sweden at the time, because they had studied that and made their own version of it work within these songs. And in a lot of ways, there's still some of that Bathory influence that I had mentioned in this tape. So the way those things work together is sort of the way they work together in Unanimated or other bands that I've mentioned along the way. So I would recommend that you check this out if you liked a lot of the stuff that we covered in 1993 and especially 1992, because this felt like it took a lot of those ideas, didn't quite take everything that Eucharist had been doing or even At the Gates, and kind of did their own thing with it. It was pretty smart for its time and worth checking out. Thy Serpent were, I would say, an important black metal band out of Finland, and one that started out very humbly on this first demo tape, Frozen Memory. Frozen Memory it's somebody who had obviously taught themselves how to do all of these things and been listening to metal that way. And so it is very much a demo tape, but also just a showing of skill that wasn't quite there. I would point to the drums as a good example of a lot of these songs not using cymbals at all. A lot of them focusing on the very most basic bones of rhythm, and a lot of it being kind of off. But you could tell that there's a kind of a classic influence to the riffs. They flow quite naturally on this, and you could tell they wanted to combine the keyboards into the music more, but hadn't quite figured that out yet. As basic as a lot of these parts are, we're getting a preview of how Thy Serpent would quickly learn and grow over time. So it takes, I think, 2 years, and we end up with Forest of Witchery, which is, most people feel like that's a classic of, Finnish black metal of a certain type, and I've always enjoyed this band quite a bit. We'll eventually get there to something of more appreciable quality, but you could tell the ambition was getting there with this first tape. He didn't quite know what he was doing yet, but it still had a vibe to it, I guess, a black metal feeling to it. So in terms of talking about Swedish melodic black metal and bands that were just outright in that style, we should look right to the 1994 demo from Mork Grinning as something that's always been passed off as a band that were they were basically described as a dissection clone early on, and a lot of, even whether it was a zine back in the day or it was people writing retrospectives of the band when they came out with a more recent full length as after they came back, they've always been reduced to being part of a scene and hangers on, and never been appreciated for being artists who were doing a lot of things all the time, who were just generally just as engaged with many types of extreme metal and heavy metal that this time period in Scandinavia, who had the access. They were just participating alongside all their other friends doing it. And I've always felt it was kind of shitty the way people were like, oh, I don't know, it's like a dissection clone. It's like, anyway, my point is that these folks were involved with bands like Hypocrite and other groups that were pretty interesting along the way, Internal Oath and whatnot. More to fur as well later on. And Mort Grinning was just one of their projects. It certainly started out in the melodic black metal sphere, and it had a lot in common with a lot of the other bands on No Fashion at the time. But they were one of the bands that put out one of the earlier full lengths that were full on in this style, that were, you couldn't argue it was anything but that. But anyway, this demo tape shows off what they were about to do. It develops the songs that they were working on for the full-length album, and as a demo tape should. Obviously, they'd been playing in melodic death metal bands as well. That's well documented. They were involved in other things, and I think that gave this some extra insight and I guess flavor, as it were. Otherwise, there isn't that much to say about this demo tape. I'd rather talk more about the album, and that's kind of what I just did. But basically, anything that came out of No Fashion is a little bit relevant here. And this is, I believe, the demo tape that got them signed to the label. And it's recorded clear enough that it's worth listening to for its general focus on melodies. There's some very strong and memorable melodies that come up front. They arrive via keyboards, and then they are elaborated upon within the song. The interesting thing about Mort Grinning, in particular early on, was the way that they introduced and developed melodies that were threaded throughout the song and extrapolated in different directions. And this wasn't all that sophisticated in theory, and we sort of get the feeling that they went for effect, and then they moved on to the next song. And something about their work was maybe more effective and easier going than a lot of their peers. And I think that's at least one way to characterize how their sound was different than something like a Dissection, which was very much a different thing, even at this time. So otherwise, there's a lot of trivia you could throw in about this band along the way. I think we can do more of that when we talk about their full length. And I just wanted to mention that they were part of other bands, and it's kind of a cool band to talk about anyway. So definitely give their demo tape its dues, and check out some of their other bands like Hypocrite and Eternal Oath, just to get a sense of what else they were doing at the time and how some of that was applied and some of it wasn't to what they were doing in this band. So I don't have a long transition into the third part here just yet. There's not a lot to really say about 1994 so far. What we're doing a lot is a lot of housekeeping and picking up the pieces of what was kind of outliers and interest in the middle of the year. This would have been a lot of these summer releases, and as we work through July and a little bit through past that point, we move towards the end of the year, and that's where the density of more important and full-length releases show up in the last third of 1994. So we're going to be talking mostly about better known bands in the next part, and I wanted to focus on these lesser known groups in the middle of the year, because I just felt like more context was needed beyond 1993 and how a lot of those releases directly affected more than just Scandinavia, and those ideas had spread pretty far and wide pretty quickly throughout the globe at this point, to things that were legitimately considered melodic black metal adjacent. And we'll get more into things that were considered melodic black metal period in the third part, as well as touch upon, again, well-known bands that everyone will know when they hear about them. So that'll be variously interesting. We'll get there, and thanks for checking it out.